The world had always felt heavy on Elijah's small shoulders. He was only 12, yet he carried the weight of centuries. The sneers that seemed to seep into every hallway, the whispers that turned into laughter behind his back, and the fists that often followed when no teacher was looking. He was a boy with a heart bigger than his body, with eyes that searched for kindness in places where only cruelty lived. And yet, the only thing that set him apart was his skin, as if being born into a darker hue was a sin stamped on him by the universe. The school was supposed to be a place of learning, a sanctuary, but for Elijah, it was a battlefield. He would walk in every morning with his head lowered, his backpack tight against him, bracing himself for the insults: monkey, shadow, dirt skin. The words stung, but worse was the way teachers pretended not to hear. They'd shrug, tell him to ignore it, as though ignoring poison could stop it from burning through his veins. Elijah tried. God, he tried. He'd whisper to himself in the bathroom mirror, I'm strong, I'm strong. But strength only lasts so long when the world seems determined to break you. At home, his mother, Mariah, was his shield. A woman with fire in her voice and tenderness in her hands. She reminded him every night, You are beautiful, my son. Don't let them tell you otherwise. You come from kings, warriors, builders of worlds. Her voice was the balm, but Elijah's scars were real, etched deeper every day. His father had been gone since Elijah was 6, another black man lost to a system that swallowed him whole, leaving Mariah to raise her boy alone. She worked nights at a diner, her feet blistered from 12-hour shifts, but she never showed Elijah her pain. She smiled through it, saving her tears for the bathroom when the door was locked. The final straw didn't come in the form of words. It came in bruises. It was a cold Friday in November when a group of boys cornered Elijah in the locker room. Their laughter echoed off the tiles as they shoved him, fists slamming into his ribs, his face. They recorded it on their phones, treating his pain like entertainment. Elijah stumbled home that night bloodied, his shirt torn, his dignity in shreds. Mariah gasped when she saw him, her hands trembling as she pressed a towel to his swollen lip. Who did this to you, baby? Who? Elijah wouldn't say. Not because he didn't want justice. He knew justice didn't exist for boys like him. He saw the truth in his mother's eyes, in the way police cars slowed when they drove past their neighborhood, in the way store clerks followed him through aisles. Mariah stormed into the school on Monday, her voice cutting through the hallways like a whip. She demanded answers, demanded accountability. The principal sat stiff in his chair, hands folded neatly, as though this were just another routine complaint. Mrs. Jackson, children can be cruel, he said, his voice measured. We've spoken to the students involved. They'll be given a warning, but Elijah must also learn resilience. The words made Mariah's blood boil. Resilience, a word used to excuse neglect, to push the burden of survival onto the victim. She stood, leaning across his desk, her voice low but sharp. My son will not be your sacrifice. You hear me? He will not. But Elijah felt the walls closing in. He stopped speaking in class, stopped smiling at home. Nights became long silences where he stared at the ceiling, wondering if the world would ever let him breathe. Mariah tried everything. His favorite meals, late-night talks, even counseling sessions. But the light in her boy's eyes was dimming. She knew it, and it terrified her. Then came the day that shattered everything. A fight erupted in the cafeteria. The same boys, laughing, throwing food at Elijah, until one of them shoved him hard enough that his head struck the corner of a table. The sound was sickening. Gasps filled the room. Elijah didn't get up. By the time Mariah reached the hospital, her son was gone. The doctor spoke in gentle tones, but the words were knives. We did everything we could. Mariah collapsed against the sterile white walls, her screams tearing through the corridor, raw and animal. The world had taken her boy, not through disease or accident, but through cruelty, a cruelty nurtured by silence, protected by indifference.
The school called it an incident. The police called it manslaughter. The boys were labeled as troubled and immature, shielded by the whiteness of their skin and the privilege that came with it. They were released back to their homes while Mariah planned her son's funeral. The coffin was too small, far too small for the life that had been ripped away. At the service, the church overflowed. Neighbors, friends, even strangers came to pay respects. Elijah lay in his coffin, dressed in his Sunday best, his face still carrying the bruises that makeup couldn't hide. Mariah stood before the crowd, her voice trembling but unbroken. "They killed my son," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "Not just those boys, not just that school, but every person who looked the other way. Every teacher who ignored the slurs, every law that let them walk free, they all pulled the trigger. And I will not rest. I will not rest until this world learns that our children have the right to live." Her words sparked something. Anger rippled through the pews, growing into a murmur, then into chants that spilled onto the streets outside. "Let them live! Let them live!" The phrase spread like wildfire, appearing on posters, painted on walls, trending across social media. Mariah had become the reluctant leader of a movement she never asked for, a mother turned warrior by grief. But grief is a strange companion. It sharpens you, hardens you, makes you willing to bleed for change. Mariah took to the streets, her voice echoing through megaphones, her face broadcast on national news. She confronted lawmakers, challenged police chiefs, called out the hypocrisy of a system that valued property over black lives. Each speech she gave was infused with Elijah's memory, each word dripping with the rage of a mother who had nothing left to lose. And yet, beneath the fire, there was the hollow ache of absence. At night, when the crowds dispersed and the chants faded, Mariah returned to an empty apartment where Elijah's room remained untouched, his sneakers by the door, his drawings taped to the wall, his laughter trapped in the silence. She would sit on his bed, clutching his hoodie to her face, inhaling the scent that was fading too quickly. It was in those moments she made her vow, whispering into the darkness, "They will remember your name, my son. They will never erase you." The movement grew. From one city to another, thousands marched under the banner of "Let Them Live." It was no longer just about Elijah. It was about every black child silenced, every parent mourning, every injustice buried under legal jargon. But movements attract enemies as surely as they attract allies. There were those who spat on Mariah's name, who called her a liar, who painted her as an angry black woman out to stir chaos. The school board tried to smear her, claiming Elijah had been violent and unruly. The boys' families cried that their sons were good kids who had made a mistake. Mariah heard it all. And with every insult, every attempt to tarnish her son's memory, her rage deepened. This was not just about protest anymore. It was about vengeance, not with guns or fists, but with truth, with exposure, with the kind of justice that could not be ignored. And so, Mariah began to dig. Mariah's grief had sharpened into something else, something fierce and unrelenting. At first she thought her only power was her voice, her ability to cry out in the streets and gather others to her side. But grief has a way of teaching you where the bodies are buried, both literally and figuratively. And when you are left with nothing but memories, you learn quickly that exposing the truth is the sharpest blade of all. She began with the school. She demanded records, files, reports that administrators had hoped would stay hidden. At first they stonewalled her, claiming privacy laws and sealed documents, but Mariah was not the type to back down. She filed requests, hired lawyers with money raised from donations, and slowly the walls began to crack. What she found made her blood run cold. Complaints of racist bullying dating back years. Students of color repeatedly ignored, suspended, or expelled for minor offenses while their white counterparts were excused. Teachers who reported the discrimination were silenced, pushed out, or reassigned.
It was no accident. It was a culture. A system that had been allowed to rot from the inside, where children like Elijah were not just overlooked, but sacrificed. Mariah released the documents to the public, and the town that had once dismissed her as just another grieving mother could no longer look away. Headlines blazed across the nation. School knew of racism, did nothing. Reporters camped outside the district offices. Parents demanded resignations. One by one, administrators stepped down, their names forever stained. But Mariah was not finished. She turned her attention to the boys who had killed her son. She learned their names, their families, their connections. She discovered that one was the son of a police captain, another the nephew of a judge, another the grandson of a wealthy developer who had donated heavily to the school board. They were protected not because of who they were, but because of who they belonged to. Their good boy reputations were shields forged by power and money. Mariah spoke their names in public, her voice steady, her eyes burning with defiance. These are not boys who made a mistake. These are killers who were taught they would never face consequences. The backlash was immediate. She received threats. Her windows smashed in the middle of the night. Anonymous letters slipped under her door. But fear had no hold on her anymore. She had already buried her son. What more could they take? The movement only grew. Young people, mothers, fathers, even veterans joined her marches. The chant, "Let them live," shook courthouse steps, city streets, and state capitals. Politicians were forced to listen, though many tried to twist her message into something palatable, something less dangerous. But Mariah refused to soften. She demanded laws, real protections, harsher punishments for hate crimes, mandatory accountability for schools. Her fight was not just for Elijah now. It was for every child with skin kissed by the sun who walked into a classroom wondering if they'd make it out whole. But as Mariah's star rose, so too did the resistance. White nationalist groups targeted her, painting her as the face of division. Talk show hosts mocked her as a woman milking her son's death for fame. Even some within her community whispered doubts, fearful of the fire she stoked. The weight was immense, and some nights Mariah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she could carry it all. Then one evening, she received a message from an anonymous source, an old janitor who had worked at Elijah's school for 20 years. He had evidence, he said. Something that could break the entire system apart. They met in a dim diner on the edge of town. The man slid a folder across the table, his hands shaking. Inside were photographs, recordings, and memos proving that not only had the school covered up incidents of racial violence, but the police themselves had actively intervened to protect white students from prosecution. Mariah's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Each document was another nail in the coffin of a system built on lies. This was no longer just about Elijah's school. This was about an entire network of power that had been feeding off silence for decades. She leaked the evidence to the press. The fallout was explosive. National news anchors recited the damning details night after night. Investigations opened, not just into the school, but into the police department, the judges' chambers, and the wealthy developer whose money had bought silence. The boys' families could no longer hide. They were dragged into the light, their names synonymous with corruption. Mariah had become more than a grieving mother. She was a storm, tearing through the carefully constructed walls of privilege. She had turned her pain into a weapon, and now she was unstoppable. But the cost of war is never light. One night, as she returned home from a rally, she found her apartment door ajar. Inside, Elijah's room had been ransacked, his drawings torn from the walls, his belongings smashed. On his bed lay a note scrawled in red marker, "Stop, or you'll join him." Mariah stood in the wreckage, her heart pounding, her fists clenched. For a moment, fear tried to creep back in, but then she thought of Elijah, of his laughter, his tears, the way he used to hug her so tightly as though he were his entire world. She picked up the torn fragments of his drawings and whispered, "They will never silence me, my son. Never."
And with that, Mariah prepared for the final act of her vengeance. The city was in chaos. Protests raged daily, police clashing with demonstrators, the air thick with smoke and anger. Mariah's name had become a rallying cry, a symbol of defiance and resilience, but it was also a target. The threats escalated, her every move shadowed by men in unmarked cars, her phone tapped, her allies harassed, yet she pressed forward, her resolve unshakable. She had learned the truth. The boys who killed Elijah would never face true justice in the courts. The system was too deeply rigged, too corrupt to condemn its own. The trials were a mockery, reduced charges, sympathetic judges, plea deals that left the killers walking free with probation and community service. Mariah sat in the courtroom, her jaw clenched, as the judge declared the sentences. Her hands trembled, not with weakness, but with fury so sharp it could cut stone. The crowd outside erupted in rage. "No justice! No peace!" they screamed, their voices shaking the courthouse windows. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, capturing Mariah's face as she walked out. She said nothing, but her silence was louder than any speech. Everyone could see it in her eyes. This was not the end. And it wasn't. Mariah turned her focus on dismantling the machinery that had protected those boys. She demanded the resignation of the police captain whose son had been among the attackers. She pushed for the impeachment of the judge who had let them off easy. She called out the developer who had funded their protection, exposing his shady deals and corrupt contracts. With each strike, she cut deeper into the roots of the rot. Her campaign drew national attention. Civil rights leaders stood beside her, celebrities amplified her message, and lawmakers who had once ignored her now scrambled to be seen on her side. A bill named Elijah's Law was introduced in Congress, aimed at enforcing stricter penalties for racially motivated violence in schools and stripping away protections for institutions that covered it up. But vengeance is never clean. The more Mariah tore down her enemies, the more they lashed back. Her rallies were attacked, her supporters arrested. The media painted her as a radical, even a terrorist, but she embraced the label. If fighting for her son's memory made her dangerous, then dangerous she would be. One night, at the height of the tension, Mariah stood on the steps of the Capitol addressing thousands who had gathered. Her voice was raw, her hands trembling around the microphone. They thought killing my son would end him, but Elijah lives in every one of you. He lives in every march, every chant, every act of defiance. They cannot bury us, they cannot silence us. We will not stop until every child, black or brown, can walk into a classroom and come home alive. The crowd roared, the chant thundering through the night. Let them live! Let them live! In that moment, Mariah felt Elijah beside her, not in body, but in spirit. She saw him in the faces of the children holding signs, in the tears of mothers clutching photographs of their lost sons and daughters. He had not died in vain. His blood had watered the roots of a revolution. Months later, the police captain was forced to resign. The judge was investigated for corruption. The developer's empire crumbled under the weight of exposure. And Elijah's law passed, a rare moment of victory in a country slow to change. Mariah returned home one evening after a long day of meetings and interviews. She stepped into Elijah's room, still preserved as it had been. She sat on his bed, holding his favorite hoodie, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to weep. But these were not the broken sobs of despair. They were the tears of a woman who had fought, who had bled, who had carved justice out of the stone walls of indifference. "Rest now, my son. They will remember your name. They will remember you forever." Outside her window, chants still echoed in the distance. The fight was not over. It never truly would be. But Mariah had turned her grief into a weapon, her son's memory into a movement. She had taken the revenge the world told her she could not have and made it into something larger, something eternal. And as long as mothers like her walked the earth, the world would never again forget the words that had become her anthem. Let them live.